Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen. Just a few weeks ago, we released 2 episodes that focused on early hominid evolution. Again, because we're still in this series of about 10 episodes so far, looking at the emergence of agape-capable beings. So we talked to Dr. Donald Johanson about the ancient hominid bones that first opened our eyes to that part of our evolutionary journey, and then to Dr. Adam Rutherford about how that story was amplified by the discovery of readable DNA in those ancient bones. Together they described the branch on the tree of life that would eventually produce humans. 2 weeks ago we looked at how those early humans and hominids might have evolved the soul, and I use that term very loosely because our guest that week, Dr. Warren Brown, emphasized the crucial difference between soul and soulishness. Last week we talked to Dr. Jeffrey Schloss about the evolutionary steps which set the stage for the evolution of morality and even religion in those early hominids and humans. And throughout those episodes we heard about our ancestors originating in Africa and migrating into Europe and Asia via the land bridge that connects those continents, which just so happens to include modern-day Egypt, Israel, Iraq, and Iran, all of which are the center stage in the Bible's description of the origin of humans and their early religions. This week, I was intending to release an episode that then looked at one of the earliest human religions, Judaism. But someone emailed me to recommend an anthropologist with a special interest in the evolution of symbolism, abstract thinking, and even of compassion in ancient hominids, and who often works and speaks within religious circles. So I thought I'd take the chance and reach out to this guy and hope that he'd be able to join us on such short notice, to see if he would put some more information on the table in front of us in our ongoing discussion of the evolution of agape-capable beings. And to my delight, he agreed. In fact, he's sitting right here in front of me right now. Well, okay, not literally, but via Zoom. Dr. Marc Kissel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Luke. I'm very excited to be here.
Marc is an assistant professor at Appalachian State University at Boone, North Carolina. He did his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison looking at information exchange among Pleistocene humans, and then did a few years of postdoc work at the University of Notre Dame within a collaborative team that, at the time, included an anthropologist and a theologian. Later, he worked with a program that helped to do science outreach in seminaries, and that put him in contact with many theologians. And as he put it in one of our emails, he enjoys talking with them about the intersection between their work and his own. So again, thanks, Marc, for joining us.
Yeah, it's very awesome to be here. Thank you for reaching out. I love getting to talk to people about this kind of stuff.
So glad you did. And again, on such short notice. Now, you don't have any particular religious belief yourself, do you?
You know, I'll say it depends. I was raised Jewish, got bar mitzvahed and confirmed. Of late, I have 2 young kids, and we've been taking them to temple, partly for the cultural aspect. I live in the South where almost everyone is not Jewish. So there is a place where we can sort of show them who they are as people. And yeah, I'd say that, I'm probably not as religious as many people are, but I do enjoy those conversations. And I really like talking to people from different faith backgrounds.
Okay. Now, are you ever surprised by how the ones that you encounter, you've interacted quite a bit with theologians, and are you surprised at how they react, or for that matter, average non-scholarly religious people, how they respond to your specific expertise, the subject of ancient hominids?
When I first started, I'd say yes, I was surprised, mostly because my training and my background led me to believe that kind of conversation would be, maybe contentious or argumentative. Whereas for the most part, when I talk to people of faith or from different backgrounds, it's mostly just a conversation of, hey, here's what I know about these things. And for the most part, the theologians I've spoken to, kind of like on your show, are very interested to know about these things, right? What do we know? What is our understanding of where we come from, what it means to be human, and how that might help a theological or religious understanding of what it means to be human. Right. So maybe the surprise is where I learned that actually we have a lot of more similarity than maybe I was originally led to believe.
Yeah, I was actually expecting you to say that you were surprised at how negative the response was, but I'm equally surprised that they were so welcoming of it. So, Marc, one of the first things we need to clarify for the listeners is the stage in hominid evolution that we're talking about in today's topic. Today, when we talk about ancient hominids using symbolism and abstract thought, how long ago are we talking, and what kind of hominid species are we referring to?
So that is, of course, the big question, right? Is like knowing when this thing began. Most biological anthropologists, so people who study human evolution, that kind of the timing of and the sequence of these events of when we began to think symbolically, whatever that means, is very contentious. I'll say that my colleagues and I have argued it's fairly old relative to human history. So we'll push it back maybe something like Homo erectus at 300,000 years ago or so.
Wow.
That being said, some of my colleagues think it's much more recent and would say only modern humans, what we call Homo sapiens, can do it. So the point of contention, and oftentimes it comes down to how you interpret the archaeological record, which is never 100% clear. But sort of to give the sort of simple answer, we're talking about a time period where there are things that look a lot like us, but maybe aren't really behaving like us. And then the question becomes, how did we evolve to sort of think in the way we do today?
Right. Now, you said as far back as 300,000 years, but I remember seeing a figure in one of your papers that went back to 700,000.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to sort of be conservative in the estimates, right? The issue here is, right, to get into the nitty gritty of the archaeology and the sort of interpretation is when you find a piece, like a piece of ochre, which is a red stone, like if you're using that and putting it on your body or using it to paint on a wall, if that is symbolic, if that is sort of a connection to something, yeah, we see evidence of that fairly old. The problem comes in is a lot of these sites that we have, the earliest things, 700,000, are poorly dated. The interpretation is up to grabs. Is that piece of ochre being used? Why is there a line on it? So it gets really, really sort of into the weeds, so to speak, of the actual interpretation. My, general take, though, is that probably that long ago, hominins, so things on our evolutionary lineage, were probably able to do these things. The problem is just finding the stuff, right? It's really hard to find sites that old because there weren't that many people around. Sites don't preserve that easily. And you have to be lucky to find these things in the first place.
Right. And so 300 or 700,000 years, still we're talking basically 500,000 years. That's quite a while. And again, the species that you're referring to when you talk about this evolution of abstract thinking and symbolism, we're talking about Neanderthals, for example, Heidelbergensis probably.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, again, one of the problems we have, I don't want to be that guy who's always saying the problems, right? But, what is a species, right? These are categories that we have put upon a sort of sample of fossils that we can find and sort of see differences. But yeah, I mean, Neanderthals, I think, almost definitely were doing really interesting things. They were engraving on the cave walls. They were probably removing feathers from birds and using those for things. It looks like they were making jewelry. And these are all like 100,000 years ago. So they're not necessarily our species. But as you learned from Adam a couple of weeks ago, right? We have genes of us in them and vice versa. So it's just a really sort of incredibly complex story now.
Yeah.
Like everything just seems up in the air these days in terms of how to actually interpret what's going on.
Right. Now, as Adam put it, the phrase he said was Neanderthals are us. Basically, we're the same species is what he was implying. So what would you say is the difference in between humans and Neanderthals? Are we different species? Are we subspecies or hybrids?
What I used to say is that every time I look in the mirror, I see a Neanderthal because, we have their genes in us. And for a long time, the definition of a species was something that could interbreed and have viable offspring. So in that sense, the Neanderthals and humans, we're the same species. Certainly the way Neanderthals were behaving and acting 80,000, 100,000 years ago is very different than what we're doing today. But that's different from anyone 100,000 years ago. So I kind of like how Adam put it, honestly. I would say that, to my mind, the sort of species question has become sort of silly.
Yeah.
Because it becomes a categorization that we make up and thrust on nature. Neanderthals didn't know that they were Neanderthals. And we now know. I mean, I think the upshot of modern genetics for human evolution is that Homo sapiens have genes from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, these other species I think Adam talked about briefly, from something called a ghost lineage, which are these species that we don't even know what they look like, but we can see those genes moving into our genome. So it's just kind of we're modern humans, whatever that means, are a hybrid of all these other things that were running around. And, that sort of, I think, is a very profound story because we were probably incorporating groups that were very different from us at one point.
Right, yeah. And so I just want to finish nailing down this idea. I want the listeners to get the idea of what kind of hominid species we're talking about. And you've agreed that we're talking about Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, of course, and then Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis, but certainly not Australopithecus. It doesn't go that far back, this abstract thinking and symbolism.
Again, like I'm going to be that guy who says, well, there was one case, right, where they found at an Australopithecine. So Australopithecines are 3.5 feet tall, brains the size of chimpanzees, essentially, maybe a little bigger, but they're walking on two legs. So they're on our lineage. And there was one example where there's it's called a Makapanscot pebble. And it's a pebble, but it looks kind of, if you squint your eyes and look carefully, it kind of looks like a face.
Huh.
And the weird thing is, it's kind of not local. The stone seems to have come from somewhere else. So, did an Australopithecine pick it up and carry it because it looked cool? It looked interesting? Yeah. How would you know, right?
Right, yeah.
There's so many other ways that could have gotten in there. And, we're very good at seeing images and pictures like, that man in the moon, right? Or
exactly.
The face on Mars, right? So all this stuff is really hard to know.
Right.
That being said, I'll say, most scientists would say it's not till you get to like Neanderthals or that kind of 100, 500,000 years ago that you really see decent evidence of, symbolic behavior.
Right, yeah. And the other species that were found more recently, Denisovans and hobbit man, that floresiensis, we don't have any data for them as far as symbolism and abstract thought.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I mean, the Homo floresiensis, those little small hobbit-like things.
Yeah.
The archaeology is just coming out now. I mean, we know there's stone tools, but yeah, we just don't have the evidence yet. And, I saw on your website, you quote Carl Sagan somewhere, right? I mean, Sagan was very big on saying absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But yeah, at this point, there's a lot we don't know.
Right.
And the other issue I'll say is that there are a lot of world areas that have not been explored as much. We're very sort of Eurocentric and sort of South Africa centric in terms of where we look for things. So There could be spaces people haven't looked yet.
Right. Okay. Now, you mentioned about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbreeding. We have evidence for that from the genetic record. And it's important to comment on, not just simply because it's salacious and we've got sex in the brain, but it shows that humans and Neanderthals are very similar. They're not only genetically compatible, clearly they would have to be, but we have a lot of reasons to think that they're culturally compatible and cognitively compatible. We interacted with them, we traded with them, right?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, we don't know. Again, we don't know how often it happened, right? But
right.
It looks like the genetic evidence suggests, because we have so much Neanderthal DNA in us, that it would have happened more than once. And, as modern humans, you don't really, for the most part, will have a relationship or even sort of an exchange with people unless there's some similarities there, right? There's usually barriers to sort of interbreeding. Right. So it would suggest, I mean, I never thought of it the way you put it, but that's kind of a cool way to put it, right? That it would suggest that cognitively, we didn't see the difference.
Yeah.
But for the listeners there, if you look at a Neanderthal skull and a modern human skull and compare them and you know what to look for, you can see differences. But if you put flesh on the skull, I don't think you would really see that many differences that would be sort of stop someone from wanting to sort of interact with that person.
But given all these similarities then, the genetic compatibility and apparently cultural and cognitive compatibility, is it safe to say that we likely followed similar evolutionary paths and we took similar steps in the evolution of our cognitive abilities?
Yeah. Well, we probably could say the Neanderthals and modern humans were different samples, different ways of being human.
Right.
But there's no one way to be human, right? And what it looks like happened is, for some reason, the population that we call modern humans enveloped the population that we call Neanderthals. there probably weren't that many Neanderthals, and they were spread out amongst Europe. When sort of the human-like group got into Europe, humans do many things when they meet, right? They exchange goods, they fight, they argue, they learn, but they always interbreed. And that also is one of the things that happened. And perhaps through those processes, both compassion and conflict, we sort of subsumed a lot of them in us. But yeah, I mean, my take is Neanderthals were as human as anyone else at the time.
So at this point, Marc, I want to take 10 or 15 minutes to talk about some of the evidence we now have for the culture and the technology in these ancient hominids. And the reason being that these things, the culture and technology, they're the outcomes of cognitive development. And there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but perhaps the first one that we'll start with will be the evidence that we have of ancient hominids beginning to dabble with symbols.
Right. So I should maybe to be clear, right? What do we mean when we mean symbolic behavior or symbols? So for most archaeologists, right, a symbol, we sort of use what Charles Peirce, right, was a philosopher of like the late 1800s, early 1900s. But essentially he had said, well, there's signs or things you see, and the link between the sign and the thing it stands for has different ways of connecting. They can be icons, which look like the thing they signify. So like the sign on the restroom wall saying who enters that room is iconic, right? Because it resembles that. There's indexes, which are like causal connection. Smoke is an index of fire.
Okay.
Porcupine quill is an index of sharpness.
Right.
And the point is that, non-human animals can do that kind of sort of sign linkage. They're very good at that. You set a smoke, monkeys, chimps run away because they see these things. And then he said symbolic connections, or when the link between that sign and the thing it signifies is only because everyone agrees upon it. So hopefully everyone agrees that a red light means to stop, right, when you're driving. Yeah. There's no reason why red should mean to stop. I mean, you probably could come up with a reason, but it's probably just happenstance that everyone agrees, okay, red means stop, we'll stop on red. So that's symbolic thought. And the point is, symbolic thought is the basis of most language, because there's no reason why dog means that four-legged furry thing, right? We just all agree in English that's what it means. So for a long time, anthropologists and archaeologists have said, hey, symbolic thought is uniquely human, it's distinctively what we do, and then we try to find evidence for it. So the question is, how do we find that evidence? And that's what I kind of alluded to before. It's really difficult. So we have at Blombos Cave in South Africa, at about 70,000 years ago, there's a piece of ochre, this red little hematite stone with some incised little markings on it. It's not that big, maybe a couple of millimeters. It's small, but there's some sort of a little marking. At one point, and depending on whom you ask, it still is the first sort of engraved object that's sort of movable that we know of. And the argument is, well, that was symbolic. Somebody did this to signify something. We have snail shells where parasites get into them and make little holes. So there's the holes in the snail shells, but then it looks like, using a microscope, you can see that there's wear on the edges of that hole, which looks like these things have been worn as necklaces. Okay. And we can even see at the same cave in South Africa, Blombos Cave, we can see over time sort of maybe different ways in which these sort of shell beads were being worn. So maybe there's something there, right? Why do you wear necklaces unless to signal something about who you are or where you come from? Tiny little figurines and stuff like that. So then the question is, how do you know that's symbolic? And that's kind of where my work is pushing to is how do we even know this? Because it's so hard to make that interpretation.
Right. You were talking about the shells and this ochre stone that was engraved, but I've also read you were referring to ostrich egg shells and how they can often have engravings on them as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I had skipped over. So we have these, ostrich egg shells that I would say 65,000 years old. So ostrich eggs, really, really big. What we know, modern known foraging populations sometimes take an ostrich eggshell, get the yolk out, dab a little hole in it, and store water when they're sort of off on hunts. So what we find is these little shards of ostrich eggshells that have engravings on them. And there's a lot, there's hundreds of these. So some people look at them and say, oh, maybe this is a language. Maybe this is a written down language.
Right.
I mean, I'm kind of skeptical because that would be really, really early for written language. But, maybe it meant something, right? I mean, I often have no way of proving this, but maybe it was what you put on your egg and say it's yours, a signal of ownership, right? Or it could just be they're bored and they're just doodling on their ostrich eggshell when they're waiting for like the hunt to continue. Honestly, we've only really been finding this stuff in the last 20 years or so.
Oh, wow.
So we're just beginning to see what's there. And then the other thing is going back to older excavations and seeing what people missed.
Right. Now, you said these engravings on the ostrich shells, you're a little bit skeptical because you say it's kind of early for language. How early were those things again?
So the ostrich eggshells probably date till about 60,000 years ago, so 65,000 years ago. So this is before, farming, before urbanization,
right?
Before any of the earliest cities we have. So just really, really old.
Right. And the reason I was asking was because I'm aware of Babylonian clay tablets, for example, as I understand it, they're the earliest signs we have of a written language, but they're 5 or maybe 10,000 years back. So, okay.
So who knows what they mean? A lot of people have very strong opinions on these being like early writing and stuff. So who knows?
And speaking of these symbols and signs, what I often hear about are these hands that are painted on the cave walls, or they're either painted on or they're silhouetted. You sort of throw paint against a hand against the wall, and then when you remove the hand, there's that silhouette of a hand. And that's got to mean something like, I was here. Yeah,
so I mean, so the way those are made normally is you would take your hand, put it against the cave wall, put some paint or pigment in a bird bone, because bird bones are hollow, and sort of blow through that bird bone, and you get sort of that fake, sort of the reverse handprint.
Yeah.
And we see, I mean, cave art is 25. I mean, the earliest is 40,000 years ago. What's really interesting now is when I first started learning these things, many, many, many years ago, we were told that, cave art was only found in Western Europe, in France and Spain. But now the earliest cave art is actually known from Indonesia, in some of those islands in Sulawesi. So we're finding things in different places. But I think they might even have some handprints there. But the handprints are a great example, because what does it mean? Does it mean I was there? Is it a way of signifying that I'm the artist, or just that I walked by? At some level, we don't know what they mean.
But I was, not that I'm an expert, but I was thinking it must mean something like that, because you correct me if I'm wrong, but they weren't doing reverse prints of feet and reverse prints of leaves and reverse prints of whatever. They were always doing reverse prints of hands, which is a very personal representation. I took that to mean that they're basically saying, I was here.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think it has to mean something personal about them. Right. What is sort of interesting as well, it's difficult to prove, but within a group, we call dimorphism, that male hands and female hands are different. Men tend to be bigger in their shape and the ratios. So what they've done is looking at that, they've looked at sites where they have a lot of, in France and Spain, where they have a lot of these handprints, and they've tried to test, who is making the handprints. And again, with a lot of assumptions in place, it looks like women were the ones doing the handprinting.
Oh, wow.
Part. So it's kind of interesting in terms of up until fairly recently, all the reconstructions of cave artists were always men. So it's kind of nice to actually sort of see people sort of taking a second look at this stuff.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but people often say that women today, modern humans, women are better communicators, better linguists than men. So maybe that goes back 50,000 years. Now, this is kind of unrelated, but it's very related, I think, in one way. We're talking about ancient hominids communicating through symbols and signs and that sort of thing. And as I understand it, modern primates, gorillas and chimps, for example, they're not capable of vocal speech, but they are capable of hand symbols and reading symbols on a chart. So they seem to have a good ability to speak through symbols. What do you know about that?
I like this question because I think it's really important, right? This is the issue, because we want to say, what is it that makes humans unique, distinctive? Oh, we have language, apes don't. So if apes can learn to do these things, what does that mean?
Right.
There's a couple of answers here. For one is, yes, they can't talk. They tried in the 50s and 60s to get the apes to vocalize, did not end well for anybody. So then they tried, like, in the 70s and 80s, kind of famously trying to teach gorillas and chimpanzees like sign language.
Right.
Coco is probably one of the most famous one, or Nim Chimpsky, named after, Noam Chomsky. And, all of these things have most of us would kind of say it probably didn't work out very well. It's very difficult, and the interpretation is an issue.
Oh.
Because basically, nowadays you wouldn't do it because it seems unethical, really. It's sort of like, they did things like, so Nim Chimpsky, they raised this chimp in a human's house in a New York City apartment, basically. Right. And then try to teach it language, but it was like very sketchy, really, and very unethical. And then they sort of ran out of money and had to get rid of the chimp, but the chimp was raised as a human. It was very weird. And in the end, the scientists were like, yeah, it wasn't really communicating. It was just parroting back the sort of hand signals it learned in order to get what it wanted. So that's why I said the Earth thing, kind of like, oh my God, that is such a huge contentious issue.
Right.
The thing is, chimps are very good at many, many things, and they're probably better at us at many, many things.
Yeah. Whether
they can sort of communicate in that sense, I don't know. There is, though, your question reminded me, maybe this is what you were originally mentioning, is chimps do have sort of cultural practices. So within a group of chimps, when they meet each other, they'll sort of clasp their hands in ways, and the way they clasp each other's hands seems to be based upon sort of the group they live in. So that might be a sort of a signal of hello, or how you're doing, right?
Right.
Okay. One of the most controversial ones a couple of years back was chimps, I think, were taking rocks, stones, and putting them by a tree.
Right.
So this anthropologist said, maybe that's ritual. Maybe they're making a shrine. It's possible. It's just really hard to prove what a ape was thinking.
Okay, so let's move on to some other signs of the technology and the culture. We have some evidence for trading and commerce. You referred to this. Tell us about that, these ancient hominids trading and that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've actually been thinking a lot about this in terms of like the way we talk about it. So basically, obsidian is a volcanic glass. It's really, really sharp stone, and you can sort of knock it against each other and make really nice tools. And we can see that being exchanged a long time ago, 100,000 years ago or so. I used to say, hey, look, isn't that great? This is trade and exchange a long time ago. But also, that's me taking my modern viewpoint and putting it on the past, right? So it's assuming a capitalist mindset of people trying to trade stuff for things. Whereas ethnographically, from anthropology, we know sometimes, that there's a very famous, in Papua New Guinea, it was called the Kula ring, Kula, where people would exchange these little trinkets that weren't worth anything. They said they weren't worth anything, and move them across these small little islands. Well, it was really dangerous to go and sort of exchange these on these trips. And when the anthropologist asked, why do you do this for things that don't have any worth? They famously said, well, we don't trade with things, we trade with people. So they're making connections, right? So establishing who they are. Huh. So I think in some sense, sometimes we have to take a step back and say, what does it really mean, right? Maybe they were just trying to get nice stuff, right?
Right.
I mean, back then, maybe they had an idea of an aesthetic and they just wanted the pretty stone. Like we go on trips today, we want to bring a souvenir back with us.
Okay. So maybe not so much trade in the modern sense, but certainly there was interactions that involved goods of things, items and that sort of thing. Here's another one that I wanted to ask you about. We do have evidence that these ancient hominids, they sometimes buried their dead, and sometimes even in an apparently ritualistic manner. So tell us about that.
Sure. So again, like I keep saying, like you're hitting upon the most controversial ones in the field, right? So I'm going to stop hedging and just tell you what I think, but with a caveat that people disagree. So yes, we have evidence of Neanderthals burying their dead, purposely digging out a pit, putting the individual in and burying them. What is most recent is something called Homo naledi. Homo naledi is about 250, 300,000 years old in this cave in South Africa. And what's difficult is for modern humans, because we're bigger than Naledi was, they were smaller and a smaller brained. But for modern humans, and even for Naledi, to get into the cave is not just walking into the cave. You got to go through this series of these chutes and these small openings, so much so that when the archaeologists were excavating Naledi a couple of years ago, the only people who could fit in were like small women. So they were the ones who were doing, they called them underground astronauts, right? And they sort of were going into these cave crevices, and you get to the space in the middle of the cave where, after this series of ups and downs, where you just have littered with bones of this thing called Homo naledi. So the question is, well, how did they get there? Because they're not going to be accidentally washed in there. We know how to interpret what bones go through, and there's no sign of being washed in there. There's no signs of predators eating the bones. There's no tooth marks on the bones. And with the exception of, I think, one like bird bone, it's just maybe an owl that maybe flew in. It's just this Homo naledi thing, the sort of extinct species of human. So the question then comes in, I think, is, well, what does that mean, right? Is that a kind of burial? Is that something else? For me, that is pretty much a burial, right? You're taking these critters, someone's putting them in there and then leaving. And it's sort of surprising. I mean, we didn't assume someone that long ago would be burying their dead.
Right.
So when it came out 4 or 5 years ago, it really sort of shocked a lot of people who thought, hey, you know what? Only modern humans can do this. So that's kind of, I think, where the field is moving, is trying to be a little more open about how earlier human species interacted, right? We tend to think only modern humans bury their dead. Well, maybe not. So their brain size was probably about half our brain size. So that's why I'm kind of saying that we thought their brains are so small, something that small brain wouldn't have symbolic thought, wouldn't bury their dead. Well, maybe they did.
Maybe they
did. If it did, what does that mean,
Yeah. So this cave you're describing in South Africa that had only these Homo naledi bones, did they also find amongst those bones any artifacts of any kind, tools, weapons, food,
As
beads?
of now, no. They're still looking, and that's why it's weird. It's just bones.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm wondering if they would find any, so this is a deep, dark cave. So I'm imagining these things, these people, let's call them people, carrying some kind of torches, burning branches. So would there be burn marks? Would there be half-burnt pieces of wood? Did they find that?
You would think so. Archaeologists and fossil hunters keep things close to the vest sometimes. So it's complete. Like, I've always assumed they must have had torches of some sort, right? They haven't reported on them yet. But, I always tell my students, as soon as I say something, the next day they'll report something else. So who knows? Yeah. The assumption would be that, it was completely dark. So they definitely had to have some sort of, way of lighting the way, a torch or something. In 200,000 years, that evidence might have dissipated, but it might be there. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I should be clear that they haven't really excavated. These bones are just on the surface. They've done a little bit of excavation. So like maybe if you excavated further down, you would see more evidence because, maybe I wouldn't be surprised if very soon we find that evidence.
Right. Okay. Now this is all naledi. That's one subspecies or species of Homo. But also Neanderthals, you mentioned that they buried their dead. And I thought it was a little bit more elaborate. I've heard several times some of these burials, they would be surrounded by the remains of flowers as if there was a decoration of the dead body. And I think some of them were buried with items, valuable items, beads, jewelry, or weapons, for example.
So, I mean, we do have some Neanderthals 80,000 years ago. They're buried with shells that look like something was done with them, maybe with beads, for sure. And we do have like evidence of maybe a burial of a Neanderthal that had flowers placed on top of it. Skeptics would say, well, maybe the flower pollen just blew in. I mean, you can always make an excuse, right?
Right.
Yeah, with the Neanderthals pretty consistently were burying their dead. You can then ask, what that means. And that's where it gets, I think, a lot funner, but a lot harder to know what it means, like why they're burying their dead. But I think with Neanderthals, we're pretty sure they're burying their dead now.
Right. And where I'm going with this then is exactly what you just said. The fact that these burials were somewhat ritualistic and so carefully done, it suggests a belief in an afterlife, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you could, if you were an arch skeptic, you could say, okay, well, you want to bury the dead to get them away and not have predators come. But there's other ways to handle that, right? So I would think it means, if you bury the dead, if you're giving them like something they might need, or just burying them, like, to my mind, it means one of two things. you can, most of us concentrate on what it means for the body, the individual who died, who passed away. What did they need? What was the afterlife like for them? How do we think about that? But also, I think maybe a better question for anthropologists is, well, what was going on with the people who buried that individual, right? What were the rituals they needed? How are they dealing with this grief? To me, it kind of suggests a level of grief, a level of sort of, need to sort of share in this sort of experience of burying the dead, whether you're dragging them into a cave or just burying them with these little flowers. It suggests that there was this sort of maybe, more human-like ability to sort of say, let's come together and let's grieve for the passing of our friend.
Right. Okay. Another thing I read that you talk about, and for that matter, your colleagues do as well, is musical instruments, that these go back quite a ways as well. And tell us a bit about that technology.
Yeah. So, we find evidence 30, 40,000 years ago of what might be flutes. So it's really hard, but you have like a bone of maybe a bird because they're hollow, and you find little holes in them. And people have reconstructed these and then try to like play them and see what kind of notes they make. And it sounds like they probably were, musical instruments of some type found at like a Neanderthal site. Right. And yeah, the music thing to me is really fascinating because, why would you do music, right? Where I'm going with this is kind of maybe where you were going with the burial is that we tend to want to explain things with a function. Okay, well, what was the function of this music? But people do things for reasons that don't have any function, right? They do things because it's fun, because they enjoy the sound, because they want to, make music and be in groups. An archaeologist in England, a man called the name by Stephen Mythen, wrote a book called The Singing Neanderthal. And at the time, we didn't know much about music that old, but he pointed out that, music could be the sort of the rudiments of more advanced language, the rudiments of a lot of sort of cultural practices, because, every group has some form of music. And maybe that is something that we share with the Neanderthals.
Right. Now, I was going after this point for two reasons. One of which is just to show that these ancient hominids were actually pretty smart. They had it takes a lot of advanced intellect to recognize this hollow tube, the bone, and you put holes in distinct places, different spacings. You have to think that through, and then even the way you blow through this, that takes a little bit of a technique. So it's an indication of some intelligence for sure. But the other reason, now you hinted at the fact that, why would they have music? Maybe they just wanted to have fun. They were just, pull out the beer and play some music. But I also think that music is deeply spiritual, certainly for modern humans. Across the globe, music is a deeply spiritual thing. It's involved in all religions. And so I just wondered if this was another sign of this emerging religious streak in the ancient hominids.
Totally possible. I'll tell you, like, the joke in the archaeology world is whenever we find something we don't know what its function was, we say it's ritual. We say it's sort of, it has a ritual significance. And my take is always things have multiple uses, right? So yes, that flute could have had a functional use to sound nice, but I agree with you, Luke. I think it probably was about ritual, getting people together. That's a very religious experience, right? It's not what I study, but anthropologists who do study music talk about the sort of the religious experiences of music, of listening to music, of being part of that group, right? of the earlier religious sort of experiences of music and the monks chanting and all this stuff. Totally possible. I think this is one of the reasons why I enjoy talking to my non-colleagues, because my colleagues just want to get into the exact data, and that's fine. But I kind of like thinking, okay, well, what does it mean for them?
Right.
Because why were they doing that? Why did they? It wasn't like they were going to have, from a biological standpoint, right? You just have to have babies. So like playing a flute isn't going to do that probably, but it probably, maybe it made them feel good. Maybe they were sort of part of this more the spiritual side of hominins is something we might never know exactly. But I think these things are hinting that something really interesting is happening.
Right. Now, another indication of this intellect that I was getting at with the musical instruments, we've already gotten a little bit into this already. You've already referred to it to some extent, but I want to unpack it a bit more. So this idea of the technologies that these ancient hominids developed, they used abstract thinking to reason their way through certain problems. And so, for example, their intelligent and planned use of fire is an application of this kind of thinking. It sounds so simple to us, but to build the fire, to put it in the right spot, and to use it for certain purposes, that involves some planning and reasoning through. They were skillful makers of arrowheads and axes out of a very specific kind of a flint stone. And modern people have to work very hard to master the kind of skill needed to turn these flint rocks into useful weapons. And then I've also heard that Neanderthals created this amazing form of superglue from birch bark, a certain way that they cooked it, to create this superglue that they used to attach their flint heads to the arrows. So these are all signs of thinking and reasoning and abstract thought.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, right? I mean, like the fire example is perfect because it's not easy to make a fire without sort of modern technology. And the birch bark sort of super glue, you have to heat that to a very high temperature. That's not just making a fire. It's getting the temperature to the exact right, the fire to a good temperature where it's going to melt it in a certain way.
And if I can interrupt you, Mark, in addition to the heat that you just referred to a moment ago, I think part of the secret was you had to heat it in a way that there wasn't a lot of oxygen available so that you didn't just cook it. You didn't just burn it up. You more or less, in a sense, melted the birch bark into this glue.
Yeah, exactly. So it was multi-component steps, right? So difficult. And, we tend to be surprised, like, oh, how could they have done that? But they were smart and they had ways to solve these problems. So I'm no longer surprised when these things come out because I'm like, of course they could do that, right? Why should we be surprised that Neanderthals, which had a lot of us, looked a lot like us and behaved like us, of course they're doing things that we could do. I think it's probably at the point now where we shouldn't be surprised. But it does go to show how smart they were.
Yeah. Now, in addition to being smart, I want to talk about one last thing. You've written in the past about the wisdom of ancient hominids, and you've been criticized for doing so. So I want to hear about that. But before you mention that, I just want to remind the listeners that the name of our species is Homo sapiens, which is Latin for wise hominid, as opposed to, Homo neanderthalensis or Homo heidelbergensis, all the other homos. We are called the wise hominid. So, Mark, tell us about this wisdom that we seem to have had back then.
Yes. So the backstory here to the wisdom. So I was a postdoc at Notre Dame. And at Notre Dame, my postdoc, as you mentioned at the very beginning, was sort of this co-sponsored by an anthropologist named Augustine Fuentes and a theologian named Celia Dene Drummond. And they came up with this proposal when they were both this sort of static workshop in Princeton to what does it mean to be human? How do you live human fullest? And they called it the Human Wisdom Project. So why we talked about wisdom is what my colleague Augustine and I were trying to do was to avoid drawing lines in the sand, saying, okay, here's when we became human. We thought about talking about wisdom was all the way around this and saying, instead of talking about symbolic as the thing that makes us human or fire as the thing that makes us human or meat making us human, it's instead this really complex interweb of things. And then that was more so working with the theologians, the idea of wisdom as something that is sort of deep and human, and that is not necessarily one facet, right? It's not one thing. I'm very skeptical of trying to define, as you may have noted, defining one thing that makes us human, because that's a really bad move. I think the history of anthropology has shown us it's really a bad idea to say who is human and who is not based upon a physical or behavioral trait. So the wisdom was our kind of way of getting around that. But yeah, our colleagues, were like, what are you doing? Why are you working with theologians? What is this nonsense? But, nowadays, a lot of them kind of have come around to thinking, at least, there's a lot to be said for not oversimplifying what is a very, very complex thing, right? It's very complex to be humans. Humans are very, very complex. And with the super glue, why would we not expect that complexity to be much older? It's only because we want to make Homo sapiens so important that we say we can't see it in the Neanderthals. Okay.
So what we've been talking about so far then is all these different indicators that we have of the intelligence, the reasoning abilities, the abstract thought, the symbolism in these ancient hominids, and more or less from a scientific point of view, although we referred in passing to the religious aspect. But that's what I want to do now, is to now look at all these things again very quickly and point them towards, could they have played a role in a developing religious streak in these ancient hominids? Again, this is part of that overall arc that I've been trying to explore in the episodes, the past 10 episodes or more, this arc that leads to agape capable beings. And so we've just talked about symbolism and abstract thinking and apparent belief in the afterlife and the creation of these musical instruments. These are all key ingredients in religious thinking in modern humans. And yet we're seeing these already in these hominids a couple 100,000 years ago. Every modern day religion has hefty doses of symbolism and abstract thinking, belief in the afterlife. And again, we now find music in basically every religion known to us today. So do you think, and this is speculation, I know, Mark, but do you think we can infer with any kind of confidence that those early hominids, 50 to 100 or 200,000 years ago, they were starting to flex and exercise their religious muscles?
I would say, and I would tell my colleagues that, yes, I think we could begin to at least suggest that is the case. Because why else would you do this thing? Now, I mean, I am far from an expert on these topics, but belief and religion are two very different things, right? I mean, they're related, but they're very different. So, like, I would think that certainly, now, whether or not, there's a lot written about the evolution of religion, and I'm by no means an expert on this stuff. I think, though, we could say they had beliefs. They had beliefs, maybe beliefs in something higher than them, beliefs in an afterlife, right? Why would you engrave on ochre? Why would you do music? What is this meaning is going to be really hard, but I don't see why, if we can do it today, I'd say, I don't see why it couldn't have happened 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 years ago.
Right.
It might be like the way we think of it, religion today is probably very different than it was in the past. There weren't that many people. We were sort of foraging. We weren't really like living in major cities. So the religion would have been different, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't be surprised if they had a belief in something.
Right. Part of my point, though, is you're right that all of these things we'll never know for sure. And so we can speculate that it had a religious nature of some kind, but it could have meant all kinds of other things. But here's the point. If you find these diverse lines of evidence that all can point down to the same thing, and they're very diverse, they're unrelated. So things like musical instruments and ritual burials and abstract symbolism on these things, they don't all necessarily point only to religion, but they all can. If all the arrows point to the same thing, it makes it possible that there's something there to talk about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess that's what sort of I was agreeing with you. I was trying
right, yeah.
I think all these lines of evidence are saying, hey, something really important and interesting is happening. We don't really see it so much in the non-human primates. We see it in humans. And yeah, it's totally plausible to me that they had these ritual and they even had religion. I don't see why they wouldn't have.
Right. And in what you just said a moment ago, you used the word humans there twice, these non-humans or the humans, but I think you mean hominids, right? Because we're not only talking about Homo sapiens, we're talking about Neanderthals, Naledi, you suggested.
Right, yeah.
So
I'm being kind of coy because I like calling them all human because it's easier for me than remembering species names. Right. So I would say yes. So hominins. I think my guess is by the time you reach the genus Homo, they have the ability of doing these things. But how they did them was probably very, very different, sure. and that might be where we need to rethink as archaeologists and anthropologists. We need to rethink what kind of signals we're looking for. We're not looking for the same signals we see in modern humans because we're very different than we were, even 10,000 years ago, we were very different people.
Right. So all of this is coming out a couple 100,000 years ago. And 2 weeks ago, we talked about hominids possibly 200,000 years ago, developing this thing that we call a soul, or as my guest put it, soulishness. And last week, Jeffrey Schloss talking about a morality developing around the same time. All these things that are popping up, suggesting, as I put it a few moments ago, that these ancient hominids are beginning to flex that religious muscle that's developing in their brain.
Right. So with these ideas that we're seeing morality, perhaps, we're seeing evidence of religiosity, we're seeing all these things. Part of it is a pushback. And we're beginning to push back on these things that maybe it's not just modern humans. Hominins have these abilities. Whether they had the idea of a soul, whether they had a soul, that is beyond my knowledge. That's not something I don't know. But to my mind, and hope this is not might not be what people want to hear. To my mind, the question is not whether they had a soul, but whether they thought they had a soul. And I think that was really interesting, right? Because at the same time, we're also seeing ramping up of, people getting along. We're seeing people exchanging genes with not just between species, but different groups of humans are exchanging genes. We see, signs of compassion. We see signs of people taking care of each other. And these, I think, are all happening around the same time, is telling us something is happening. Now, what it is, I wish I...
Now, actually, Marc, you've hit on something that's exactly where I want to go with this. You mentioned the compassion and taking care of each other. All of the things that we're talking about here and what I've been doing over the past 10 episodes are all part of a series of episodes looking at the cosmic, the geological, chemical, and biological evolution that eventually leads to humans. And to some extent, the story we're telling is no different from the same story that any non-believing atheistic person who accepts scientific findings, they would say the same thing. All these different processes led to humans. The only difference is that what I'm doing in these episodes is getting at the idea that maybe there was some kind of a divine being behind all of it, that it was not just a random accident that happens all by itself, that there's a goal behind it, and that goal being to produce these beings capable of working together in complete symbiosis. And because of the religious nature of our podcast, we've been referring to this ultimate goal as producing agape-capable beings, and agape being simply another word for selfless love. Mm-hmm. So in your research on hominid evolution, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically was you've shown ancient hominids being much more compassionate and peacemaking than the reputation we modern humans have tended to give them. Many non-experts have in their heads the image of these ancient hominids. They were all brutal and aggressive. They're always walking around with a club in one hand, kind of like modern-day gang members, always having a gun or a knife in their pocket. But you almost paint a picture of them as hippies from the 1960s flashing peace symbols and singing, "All you need is love." So tell us about this ancient hominid compassion and peacemaking.
Right. So my other sort of bag, other than the symbolic stuff, has been like evolution of warfare and evolution of peacefare. And along with my colleague Nam Kim, we wrote a book called The Emergence of sort of Warfare. But the point in the book, as we were writing it, we wrote the book, and there was this issue as, are humans innately warlike, or are we innately peaceful? And how old is war? Is it something that happens with, urbanization and people settling down? Is it the outgrowth of that? Or is it really, really old? And does it have its roots in the Pleistocene, in the Ice Age, right? And before that. So as we were writing this book, we kind of changed I changed what I thought. And we kept on saying, you know what? It's not that we're innately warlike or innately peaceful, is that we're innately group living, right? As you were sort of alluding to, I think before, that we live well in groups and we like being around people sometimes, so that, warfare and peacefare are not two sides of the same coin. They're both ways in which we sort of express this idea of group living. It's really horrible talking about war. If you're listening to this recently, right? Right now we know. We can't turn on the news and horrible things are happening right now. So we sort of see these stories where we think, okay, humans are warlike and violent because look what's happening. But at the other side of the coin, we also get along very well, but we don't really pay attention to those things. A bunch of anthropologists have often pointed out that you put humans on an airplane, most of the time they get along. But we hear the horror stories when they don't.
Yeah.
But most of the time they do, and they have no problem. You put chimpanzees on an airplane, they're going to kill each other.
Right. Very,
very quickly. So there is this kernel where we tend to sort of remember the violence, and it's probably partly what we like. For some reason, we like talking about this. The last podcast I was on was all about cannibalism. So people like talking about these things, right? And also it's easier to see because we can find marks on bones that look like they were killed. But we also see signs of compassion. My colleague, someone you might want to reach out to one day, Penny Spikins, she studies compassion in Neanderthals and looking for evidence of someone taking care of them. There's something called Homo erectus, which was before Neanderthals. And at 1.7 million years ago, there's a site of Dmanisi in Georgia where an individual has lost all their teeth, but seems to have lived for quite some time after. So someone was taking care of them. So I think there's I would agree. I think there is a sign of some sort of compassion and sort of collaboration and getting along I mean, as horrible as warfare is, it is collaboration, right? It is convincing people, hey, you all get together and do this thing. It's probably taking our innateness in a bad way, and people are taking advantage of that.
Right.
But that's sort of how I take it, nowadays.
So, Marc, we're coming close to the end of this interview, but while I'm talking with you, I thought I'd at least get your thoughts on a few other hominid or human cognitive abilities. These aren't your specific area of expertise, but I guess you've read a lot, you've heard a lot about these things, you've gone to conferences and talked about these things, so you have some insight into them that we could find valuable. So one of them, for example, is the idea that humans are exceptionally good at seeing patterns in otherwise random things and making connections that aren't there. And maybe another one that's very closely related to that is agency detection, the tendency to perceive beings everywhere. We hear a sound in a dark room, and the first thing we do is call out who's there. We think there's somebody, something there. Or when we see a pair of circles within a larger circle, we immediately perceive a face. You referred to that face on Venus, or we can see them in puffy clouds. So any thoughts from an anthropologist on this tendency for humans to see patterns and detect agency? And does it seem to go back millions of years?
I think this is a great question to think about because it seems to make sense evolutionarily, right? From an evolution standpoint, if you hear rustling in the bushes and you ignore it, and it's some sort of large cat that's going to kill you, that's not a good thing, right? So it makes sense that we would hear things and we would bolt because we want to be careful. Or at least we would investigate, right? When you're falling asleep and all of a sudden your leg jerks and it wakes you up, some folks think that's sort of a holdover from when primates lived in trees and didn't want to fall out of the tree or something like this.
Huh.
So I think that, certainly that ability to sort of recognize patterns or see patterns, as you put it, when they're not there was probably really, really helpful for humans at one point. Maybe the problem nowadays is that because we're so good at finding patterns, we then sort of see patterns when they're not there, right? So someone goes to Vegas and thinks, oh, there must be a pattern in the roulette wheel.
Right.
Or a pattern. I mean, I love my mom, but she constantly thinks there's some lottery patterns going on, right? That you're going to be able to break the system. So the fact that it's very difficult for us to sort of actually know what randomness is, to me, that's really interesting, right? I mean, it's really fundamentally a difficult math problem to actually come up with random numbers because you can't really do that because computers can't. They can sort of simulate random numbers, but they can't actually come up with random numbers.
Right.
So I think this is maybe not where you were going with the question, but I think for me, it would make perfect sense that we're good at pattern recognition, that we're good at seeing agency detection because we needed that.
Right. And you're right, this isn't quite where I was going with this point. So in addition to the agency detection, which gave us greater survival, I'm getting at something different. When we heard this noise, we didn't just jump back and gasp, but sometimes we go, who's there? We think there's a being there. Or we look at the cloud and we see a being in the cloud. We see the circle with two other circles and we think there's a face, a being. So that tendency in humans to see beings in places.
Yeah, we can see these things, and I don't know what that means. I think it's really amazing that we do that. I don't know why we do that, But yeah, certainly the who's there aspect seems universal, right? We all look for patterns in the clouds and seeing a face in the clouds. I think that's innately human.
Right. And so related to that then, I mean, another aspect, another side to agency detection is we often see purpose and even causal agency in events. So if something bad happens to us, many people ask themselves, why did this happen to me? As if there's a reason, as if it was somehow intended. Or if we just see something unusual, we think that somebody did it that way. It doesn't make sense that it just happened, so we say somebody did it that way. I had an example that occurred to me. Sometimes if you're walking through the forest, you'll see this thing called a fairy ring, which is a whole bunch of mushrooms arranged in more or less a circle. Mushrooms in the middle of the forest floor or a lawn that form a circle. And you think, okay, somebody planted them that way. When in fact, what really happened was there was a tree there decades ago that died and rotted away. And those mushrooms are now inhabiting the remains of the bark of that tree. But again, we look at that and we go, oh, somebody planted them and maybe they were fairies. That's why we call them the fairy rings. So that idea of agency detection, we immediately jump to the idea that there's beings there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just thinking I agree. Like, I think it is something we do, right? And like, we want to like make it theological, right? We want to give purpose to things.
Right.
And that, I think, is innately human too.
That's what Jeffrey Schloss talked about last week. He said that they do studies with children, for example, and they show that children, this is the phrase that he used, they're promiscuous teleologists. They always find that there's a purpose for things. So, for example, if you ask them, why do we have lakes? And the kids will answer, well, we have them so that we have something to swim in. Why do we have trees? Well, so that monkeys have something to climb. So these children naturally think there's a purpose for this. There's a functional purpose for that.
So they're like a Dr. Pangloss in Candide, right? They always need a purpose for things.
Right. So as an anthropologist, another aspect that I just want to get your thoughts, and again, knowing that this is not your area of expertise, but humans are naturally social animals. We move in packs and tribes. We naturally identify a leader. And when enough tribes start to interact with each other, then you start to develop these hierarchies, these overlords and kings and emperors. We've seen this all through human history. So do we have any evidence of that in these ancient hominids, this idea of them being very social, moving in tribes, identifying leaders of any kind? Any evidence for that?
My best sort of off the top answer is, why would you be wearing, like, we talked about these beads that they were wearing or these engraved ochres. And like part of me would think that, like, why do you decorate your body or wear beads? It signals who you are, right? So that to me could be a signal, a sort of a sign of this developing this identity that I am me and you are them. You know, I am the people from the west side of the valley who wear the necklaces in this way. That might be the best I can think of off the top of my head in terms of sort of building sociality. At the time, we don't see any evidence of like rulers, like in that sense. That's much more recent. No. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. We just don't see evidence of them.
Right. But so even taking a step back, do we see evidence that those ancient hominids also were very social? They moved in tribes. They set up tribes.
Yeah. Okay. I see a question. I mean, it's just really, really tricky, right? Because the problem is with archaeology is that it's not like Pompeii, right? When the volcano came and everything was frozen in time. We do see like 80,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, we do see certain kinds of stone tools that sort of seem to spread in sort of circular patterns in different parts of the world. Within Southern Africa, we see different sort of stone tool traditions. And those could be tribes of people moving around the landscape, exchanging ideas.
Okay. And so where I'm going with that is just getting the sense that these early signs of characteristics of humans today that feature prominently in religions, that we become tribal in our religions, and we use the threat of ostracization. You have to believe the way we do, or you will no longer be part of the tribe. And that's a very scary thing for humans. We are very social animals. So I just wondered if we begin to see the signs of that tribalism or that need to be social, needing to be attached to a group, if we saw that in the ancient hominids as well.
I mean, we don't see it specifically, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if we had that. I just think it's a problem is that we just don't have the resolution for that.
Right.
Certainly, we have evidence from modern people, from modern foraging populations, where yes, being ostracized is the worst thing that could happen to you.
Right.
And certainly in ancient Greece as well, right? So like in industry, so like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they were doing that. I think they clearly probably were. I just don't think I can point to a specific, data point that says that.
Right, not definitively, and I get that. And I did start this last section just saying, hey, we're going to be speculative here. But what I've been wanting to do in this episode is to look at these glimpses, these hints of things in the ancient hominids that later appear in fully modern humans that become key ingredients for our religious streak.
I mean, I have no problem being speculative and saying, yes, there's probably what we see now. There was versions of that in the deep past.
Okay. All right. So before we go then, did I miss anything? Did we talk about everything that's relevant to this particular topic, or for that matter, something you'd like to just let the listeners know about what you're doing?
I mean, I would just go back to the fact that anthropologists for a long time, and I think you had mentioned this before too, we thought, okay, when humans are violent, we're aggressive, we're always at war with each other, and that is what made us human, sort of. And I think we need to push back against that, which kind of seems to be what you're doing, right? Thinking that there's...
Right.
I'm blanking on the word that your guest last week talked about, but like how there is, other orientation. I think that's
right.
Really, so like my game, I'm going to go look more into this. I think that's really fascinating idea.
Yeah, that idea that there's these two driving forces, not just in hominids, but Jeffrey's point was that goes back billions, with a B,
Right.
billions of years. Organisms that, on the one hand, are driven by a very self-directed force. I'm going to survive, and I'm going to steal from you, and I'm going to kill you if I have to. That goes back even to bacteria. And then opposing that is this other force that's other-oriented, where organisms, again, even at the cellular level, realize they don't have a consciousness, but they develop strategies that involve cooperation and symbiosis, mutual dependence, and living together. And the phrase that Jeffrey used, which I thought was cool, they learn to snuggle together rather than struggle together. So these very opposite forces going back right to the very beginnings of life. And both those forces are producing more and more complex life till finally get to these humans. And as you just said, now we have to see what humans will do with these two forces. Are we going to let that selfish streak predominate, or can we develop this other-oriented streak, this agape love?
Yeah, and I would just say that I think the move now in anthropology is to avoid saying there's one way to be human, right? If we say that, okay, we're naturally violent, that might excuse some behavior. I think we need to say that we're naturally cooperative and we like to live in groups, and there's many ways in which that can be produced.
Okay.
That's kind of where my work is going.
Excellent. And I will leave links to your sites, your faculty page, and as well you've got a personal blog page or a website as well. I'll leave that in the show notes. So, Marc, I want to really thank you for coming today on the podcast at such short notice. As I've said, it was just a lark that I thought I'd contact you very recently, and you were very enthusiastic, and that was so great. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I was really glad to get your email. And if any listener, I'm always happy to talk, or you can send me an email. I'd much rather talk to people than do my own work. So yeah, I'm always glad to chat. Great. No, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Marc.
Yep. We'll talk soon. Bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with me, your host, Luke Jansen. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help this podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review rating at your favorite podcast catcher.